Yeah, it's such a fascinating topic. So interoception is our 8th sensory system. It's how we read and understand our internal bodily cues. So we hear a lot about our 5 outer-facing senses, so sight, sound, touch, smell and taste. And then our 6th sensory system is proprioception. So if you close your eyes and you touch your nose, you know where your nose is. But if you were to close your eyes and touch somebody else's nose, you'd probably miss. So it's our proprioceptors that tell us the position of our body in space. We have our 7th sensory system, which is our vestibular system, and that's to do with the position of our head in space and balance. But our 8th sensory system is interoception. So we can feel butterflies in our tummy, we can feel a fluttering feeling in our heart, but it's also communicating information all of the time between the brain and the body that we're not even aware of. And so it's interesting to think a lot around this flow of communication, a little bit like patterns of movement, of energy. And maybe in our Western world, we don't talk so much about this as the brain and body's communication, but in a lot of other traditions that is spoken about. But it is showing to be more and more important for our physical health and our emotional health too. If we go back to 2017, I was working as a physiotherapist. I had my own clinic, had lots of patients, and for the patients that I would see who had chronic conditions, so that could be persistent pain, they might have gut issues like irritable bowel syndrome, they were experiencing things like insomnia and anxiety, they'd often present with a cluster of symptoms. So they'd come to see me for the pain, but they might see somebody else for the gut health. They might be talking to a counsellor. They might be seeing their GP for the lack of sleep. So it's all these things that were seemingly unrelated, but for many of these clients, there was a common thread that there was nervous system dysregulation. And because the nervous system communicates with so many other systems and actually drives what happens, it was as though I felt like there was this missing piece of the puzzle. So it was like, well, I work with the body, so do I just ignore the brain? Do I ignore the emotions? And when people were having, say, a flare-up of lower back pain that they had healed, but the pain was still present, I would get really curious and say, well, what else is going on in their life? Like, what's happening? And so we can look at this with the biopsychosocial model, which is a really long word to say that health is impacted by biological factors. So say the person with the lower back pain, they might have had that initial injury to their back. And then there's psychological factors at play, so thoughts and beliefs and stories. But it's even social factors, like the people we're around, our work, financial stress, all of those things come into play to create how we feel, how we experience pain, but also the health of our nervous system. And so after having the feeling like there was this piece of the puzzle missing, and I didn't feel like the frameworks that I had to educate clients was truly empowering them or clear enough, it was as though some of the messages that they'd received were things like, your pain's all in your head, or it's just happening in your brain, and it was kind of invalidating their experience. I decided that I was going to take a year away from clinical work and really focus on getting a deeper understanding of the brain-body communication, which is actually what interoception is all about. So it's largely carried out via the vagus nerve, which, if we think about its anatomy running from the brainstem to our heart, right down to our lower belly and our colon, it is sending so many messages up to the brain because 80% of its fibers run from the body up all the time. And so this is where I wanted to start working with people, and it aligns so beautifully with the science. So, you know, IBS is now being reclassified as a disorder of gut-brain communication. It's not about, well, I just won't eat this anymore and my gut will be okay. We've got to look at how the brain is sending messages down to the gut, and then messages are being relayed back up to the brain that can influence anxiety and depression. So I love complexities. I like the grey areas. I like looking for integrating and joining the dots. And for me as a clinician, what was missing meant that I couldn't truly empower my patients. And so now it's so fantastic to be able to teach other clinicians how to share this work with their own clients and patients now too. Yeah, so interoception plays a really important role in our physical health. This comes back to what we call homeostasis. So that's basically how the body keeps systems balanced or stable. And so a lot of that interoceptive information that's being relayed from the body up to the brain doesn't actually reach our conscious awareness. And that's a good thing. I mean, imagine if you felt everything you ate being broken down and digested, and all the messages that was being sent up to the brain about the stretch in your gut and things. So some people do feel those sensations, and so we can have differences in interoception. So for some people, sensations are too small or too quiet. It's like the volume's been turned down. And for some people, sensations are turned up too loud or they're too big. And in this case, following chronic and traumatic stress, we actually can see changes to how we detect sensations. So it's really important to help us feel at home in our body again. But from the physical health, if we go back to the vagus nerve's gut-brain axis, that is where we see communication always being sent between the gut and the brain. They're talking to each other 24 hours a day. But with IBS, signals that normally wouldn't come into awareness or that we feel begin to be something that we detect, and there's pain with that. So for a signal to reach conscious awareness, for us to notice it, it needs to come up to a region in the center of the brain that we call the insula. So that's deep in the center of the brain, and I like to think of it a little bit like Heathrow Airport. So it's the biggest airport in the world, and imagine planes flying in and out of it all the time. So if you imagine a plane is flying up from the gut to Heathrow Airport or to the insula, it's the way that the insula detects or notices this that will change how we experience that sensation. And if the pain or sensations in our gut reach the insula and we appraise that as bad or a threat, we will also have a lighting up of the lower centers in our brain that have to do with nervous system regulation. And then we might experience more anxiety, which can then change our gut. So when we're outside of regulation, our gut changes too. We can have it constrict, we can have blood flow move away from it. And so this is where we see this ongoing way that we detect sensations is actually influencing how our physical health is. The gut is one prime example of that. And it creates this ongoing feedback loop. So with IBS, we need to look at the nervous system. We can still look at what we're eating, that can be absolutely playing a part in it, but we need to look at how do we get more regulation from the vagus nerve, and low vagal tone is definitely associated with IBS. So it's super interesting to see interoception's role in our emotional health. We used to think of the brain as having like one area for an emotion, you know, like anger's here, sadness is here. But that's not what we see anymore. We now know that emotions are a whole brain experience. So all these different networks in the brain light up. But if we look back and say the foundation of emotions are actually bodily signals and sensations, we can say it's our interoceptive signals that are the foundation of our emotions. So if we take anger, for instance, we might notice the tension in our jaw, we might notice heat in our chest, we might notice that our heart actually beats faster. And those messages or those signals are the foundation of how we register, I'm angry. This is anger. And if we don't register those bodily signals, then we can't proactively take care of our emotions. The purpose of interoception is really to bring about this self-regulation. So if we say, okay, well, here's the bodily signals as the foundation, then here's the emotion. Now, emotions are driving an action. So there's an action for us to take. And if we think about it with anger, it's just mobilized energy. And if we actually allow that to come through, normally there is an action we need to take. So it's like we get to a point where we're like, I'm really angry about this. Right, I'm going to have that conversation. I'm going to change this in my house. I'm going to do this different work. And that's a really healthy thing. So the action that we take will then drive the outcome. And the outcome is really about bringing ourselves to a better place. It doesn't always mean that we come back to the same place we were in, but it's taking an action that is going to allow us to grow or to support ourselves. Now, we can look at this really simply with physical health in the same way as this, where we might notice my throat's dry, I'm lightheaded, I'm thirsty. So those bodily signals are the foundation of noticing our states, whether that's things like thirst or hunger, needing to go to the bathroom, but it can also be nervous system states. So then that drives us to take an action. So I say, okay, I need a drink. And then the outcome of that is we return to self-regulation. So thirst goes away, our body's back to balance, homeostasis is returned. Now, when we can't notice these signals, we can't proactively manage our emotions, and the actions we take are very different, so we get a different outcome. If I look at this from the anger again, and let's say I suppress these sensations in my body, and I say, anger's wrong, or for people who experience chronic and traumatic stress, they might think there's something wrong with me. Why can't I just get this right? I must be doing something wrong. So we internalize, and shame comes in and we shut down and we collapse and we don't take action, and then we feel worse. So that's a very different outcome for that person who might self-blame, who might get stuck. The action isn't there that supports what's happening in the bodily, with the bodily sensations and those emotions. So in essence, if we have accurate interoception, we are going to have the outcomes that support our deepest values, that help us go towards what we want, that give us this sense of proactively being able to manage the direction of our life, like having that agency, having that choice that nobody else can give us. And I think we are confusing this message that self-regulation is about pushing down, being calm, not taking action. But self-regulation is just as much about getting mobilized, about getting activated. That is just as important as coming back down again. But the key with this is that we need to be able to listen to our inner voice, and that really comes from bodily signals and this interoceptive accuracy. And it's really exciting now that there's the emotional part to this, but what I'm also seeing in the research is that when our interoception isn't accurate, we may have conditions like persistent pain. We've seen it associated with irritable bowel syndrome, as I mentioned, but also things like eating disorders, anxiety, depression, the things that we see with nervous system dysregulation. And so a lot of this emotional regulation and physical health, they just go hand in hand. They're the same networks through the brain and body. And so helping people retrain this accuracy of this system goes so beyond their physical health. It's their whole person health. And that's really why I'm so passionate about it. Yes, we do. We do need to know how to look after ourselves emotionally. And so we can start with really simple ways to do this, where we're noticing bodily signals, doing the things we love. So that could be something playful. It could be something exciting. And as we read those bodily signals accurately, that's one way we can start. I might say to you, okay, so how do you know when you're excited? And you might say, well, my heart feels a bit faster. There's an energy or a buzzing in my belly. So we can start to bring in this granularity, and emotional granularity has been associated with better self-regulation. So where we can come from just this emotion of I feel good to, oh, hang on, I'm noticing this. It's actually the emotion of excitement. Oh, I'm noticing the buzzy feeling, the warmth, the tingly. And then when we get down to those signals, that's often where we find the truth or something that might have been missing from us to understand about a situation. I think one of the mistakes that we're making is that we conflate feeling certain ways as being wrong or bad or shouldn't be there, or I need to get rid of that. Or some people cut straight to, all right, I'm just going to try and change the way I feel and expel this yucky feeling. But there's not the process of actually sitting with and experiencing that, which is what interoception is. It is a map to your best life. I think it's the ultimate way to empower yourself to get back into the driver's seat. So it's a way in a noisy world where we can actually tune out all the noise. You know, I think about the messages that come through about going faster, doing more, trying to jump on this wheel of spreading our messages quickly and as in a really fast-paced way that has never quite felt right to me. But that's over and over the advice that I'm given. And I think there's a part where I need to acknowledge this doesn't feel right and it's not the way I want to do things. So within that, we are allowed to honor what's right for us as well. And it's great to listen to other people. You know, that is definitely, there's a time and a place for that, but there's also a time where we need to trust our own voice and sometimes stand strong in that. But that's hard to do without accurate interoception. So it is actually involved with our social connections as well. And what we might say is, you know, I might say, well, I'm an empath. You know, I'm impacted by other people's emotions, by other people's moods. I feel that too. But what happens is that the distinction between ourselves and others actually becomes a little bit blurred when we don't have this accurate interoception. So for empaths, the most important thing they can do is to learn to tune back into their own bodily signals and recognize this doesn't belong to me. And when we practice that again and again and again, we will see neuroplastic change in the insula and in the areas to do with interoception. So it is just like we might sprain our ankle and we need to go and stand on a wobble board or do rehabilitative exercises that help us strengthen those sensory areas in the ankle. We can do the same thing with interoception. And so for somebody who identifies as an empath, they may have had to, throughout their childhood, look outside of themselves to see if they were okay. They had to look at other people's moods or reactions to know if they were safe. And so that's what they've learned. But through this incredible 8 sensory system, we can learn to listen to our inner voice today as an adult so that we don't feel swept away by other people's moods and emotions, and we can say, well, they can have that mood, they can have that response, but this is how I'm doing. And I love that from the relational aspect of this as well. I think there's a truth where we stay true to our own inner knowing, and for people who have had traumatic stress, there is a loss of trust in their body. You know, they have these big responses or they feel numb. And so interoception is often the missing piece for them, to be able to trust their body. We think the antidote to anxiety is to be calm, but it's not. It's actually to trust. So to trust our body, to trust our inner voice, to have the trust to make a decision that's in line with our values, to trust this isn't my emotions, this is yours. And if we give people that back, that trust, that autonomy, then they have agency. And that's the opposite of trauma, which is often powerlessness and helplessness. So I believe that interoception is one of the most empowering things that we can teach someone. And it's definitely what I'm teaching my daughter as one of the foundations for her life.
So beautifully said. Thank you so much.
Thank you.